Hello and welcome into the harvest. My name is Andrew Stroud, and this podcast is dedicated to helping you be a disciple and make disciples in the 21st century. We get the chance to bring on guests, and today I've got a good friend, Brad Palm. Brad and I have known each other for, I think, 15 years now. Does that sound right?
Yeah, we linked up back in 2009, so it's been a number of years.
Almost 15. But I wanted to have a conversation with you, Brad. We were actually just talking before we hit record. We've been talking about having this conversation since 2017. And why don't you take us back? What do you remember about that conversation back in 2017? Set the stage for us in terms of where you were at, where we were when we were talking about that.
Yeah, so 2017, it was likely, I think it was in November or early December, that meeting. And I was in a wheelchair, and you so graciously were helping me when I got myself wore out, pushed me around the DC Capitol area. So I was recovering from injuries sustained in a helicopter crash at Walter Reed Medical Center in Maryland. And we had the conversation then about coming on and recording, telling a little bit of my story and what God was doing through that accident. And so here we are years later,
right? Well, there's just more story to tell. But let me introduce you to our audience. A lot of folks may know you because we run in the same circles, and a lot of those people listen to the show. But I also know there are many who do not know you. But you grew up in Maryland. You went to college in West Virginia, and you were on a path. Was it electrical engineering? What was it that you graduated with your degree in?
Yeah, it was electrical engineering, Bachelor's of Science there at West Virginia University.
And you did that a little bit, but that didn't last very long, right? So tell us a little bit about, you are a pilot in the U.S. Army right now. How did that come about from going to school for engineering to going into the service and flying helicopters?
Yeah, so I grew up in a Christian home and was raised in the church. And when I went off to college, I would say that was the first time that my faith was really tested. And I really describe my walk with the Lord as non-existent. I was the prodigal son in Luke 15. It was, I knew God, but I didn't have any idea of what lordship looked like in my life. And so up until that point, I think I was defined by my achievements, mainly through sports as well as grades. And so when I got home from college, I was an electrical engineering intern and got offered a full-time job and was planning to live at home. And then after paying off my college debt, getting out on my own. And that lasted for about 30 days after graduation in May of 2003, dating myself a little bit now. But graduated in May of 2003. About a month later, ended up pursuing a contract with the U.S. Army to basically, they call it street to seat or high school to flight school, basically come right in, do basic training, and then go right into warrant officer candidate school through flight school. So it was, I would say, with some of the decisions I was making at the time and my lack of having a genuine relationship with Jesus, I was looking for the next accomplishment to fill that need. And that was the direction I took, as well as there was contributing factors with the World Trade Center that fell. I remember watching it distinctly from my room, my dorm, my apartment really at WVU. And so there was some desire there to also serve the country and be of use in that regard.
Yeah. And again, it's so crazy because obviously we just wrapped up this past year in Afghanistan, but I think, I think that was the longest war that our country has ever been involved in. And there are people probably listening to this show today that don't really remember, like when you made that choice back in 2003, having your degree and already being in an internship to change paths and to go into the military and ultimately become a pilot. I mean, you knew that meant basically going into combat, almost certainly. And that was, I would think, the purpose behind you making that choice at that time.
Yeah, there was definitely a call to serve, although it hadn't been something that was passed on through my family. My grandfather was drafted and went to Korea years past, but it was definitely something that it hit close to home. I can remember on the college campus, there was a guard unit that was getting ready to deploy. And it was actually, surprisingly enough, a Chinook helicopter that came and flew over the downtown campus and did a couple laps, flying an American flag out of the back of the helicopter before they flew, which was likely to an embarkation point where they shipped the aircraft overseas to go to combat. So interesting looking back on how my path has ended up flying Chinooks in combat. So.
Well, at 2003, you come into the Army. I know you said you had that background, and I think many of us do. We grow up, especially here in the United States or in the West, you might grow up hearing stories about God, maybe even being pretty close to a Christian culture. But of course, there's an old saying that God doesn't have any grandchildren, that it doesn't matter how you were raised. If you were raised around people who were close to God, each of us has to make a choice at some point in terms of what role God is going to play in our lives and how serious faith is going to be. So in 2003, it doesn't sound like that was the case. Now, you and I met in 2008. Maybe just sketch for us what happened between 03 and 08, your flying helicopters and how that all played out. What brought you to Fort Lewis, Washington, which is where you and I met in 2009?
Yeah, so I went from basic training in 2003 into 2004, and from basic training right into Warrant Officer Candidate School at Fort Rucker, Alabama, the home of Army aviation. So everyone who flies anything for the Army ends up going through Fort Rucker. So I did my Warrant Officer Candidate training there and then right into flight school, and actually was qualified initially in a Black Hawk. And so when I graduated there, I went and served my first utilization tour, 3 years in Japan, from 2005 until 2008. And then from there, I assessed for the 160th SOAR. It's the Special Operation Aviation Regiment. And I was accepted into that position in that unit. And so that basically started what brought me to Fort Lewis. So from Japan, I PCS to Fort Lewis, Washington, actually in early 2008. And I was only on the ground for maybe 2 weeks. And then I went on temporary duty. We call it TDY. And from there, I bounced back to Fort Rucker, where I got a transition into the Chinook helicopter. From there, I went to Fort Campbell, Kentucky, which is where the regiment headquarters for the 160th SOAR is located. And that's where I went through the Officer Green Platoon training and learned the tactics, techniques, and skills of the 160th Flying Chinook helicopters. And once that training was complete, I found my way back to Fort Lewis, Washington. And kind of an interesting story, ran into also probably another guy that is known on your podcast and with a lot of the people, Jamie Fisher. It was a rather interesting encounter. I was getting my combat gear issued to me actually to go on my first deployment shortly after I arrived to the unit. And Jamie started inquiring of my relationship with Jesus. And so it was a bit awkward. And then he got my number. I didn't know if he was asking me on a date or what the deal was, but he's a true brother in Christ. And I started to meet with him in the mornings, and he really started to unpack what a relationship with Jesus is supposed to look like. And that is basically how I found myself introduced to you, Andrew. I remember distinctly coming to your house shortly after I met Jamie, and then introduced to the Navigator ministry that was going on there at Fort Lewis.
Yeah. So one of the big themes of this ministry, Into the Harvest, is ordinary people in everyday places. So I know when you said you met Jamie, this was in the workplace. This was not a religious setting at all, correct?
No, it was quite the opposite. He was handing me ballistic plates and body armor and a bunch of equipment to go on my first deployment. He was at the time working as a supply technician on our compound there at Joint Base Lewis McChord now. And it was a short time that he was doing that job just prior to him changing professions. And he
Mm.
just was bold enough to share and start asking questions of someone that he never knew. And it's made an indelible
Mm.
mark on my life, certainly changed my trajectory and path completely.
You and I have so many stories like that over the years where you have those you could say chance encounters. Of course, we believe, God is ordering our lives and guiding us, and part of that is allowing us to cross paths with people who end up becoming lifelong friends. I know you and Jamie are still really close here. 15 years later, he and I are still really close 15 years later. And it all started with like you said, just a courageous conversation on his part, just to open that door. But what was it that was going on in your life, do you think, spiritually, that made you receptive to that kind of conversation?
Yeah, I think my childhood, my upbringing, the seeds were certainly planted. My parents did a great job with prioritizing church and family and Christian morals and values. And so the concepts weren't far from my mind. It was just a matter of really putting them into practice and seeing people live them out practically. Like, what does it look like to practice lordship day to day? What does it look like to seek first the kingdom? There's a lot of principles that you can read in scripture that are very difficult, I think, to put feet to. And when you're in a community of people that are living it out, they're organically living out their faith in the everyday places of life, it's attractive. And I think the seed planted in me by my parents early on and through my experience with knowing God transformed at Fort Lewis into a true relationship with God as I submitted to his lordship and really sought a relationship with him. So I think that was the catalyst for growth.
Do you think that there was any part of it where, like, you're one of the most high achieving people I know? I know we kind of just blew through your story there, but I mean, to become a pilot in the Army, not everyone can do that. And then I know we quickly ran through from '03 to '08, but you became a pilot in 160th SOAR, which is a Special Operations Aviation Unit, which is elite. Not anyone can get into that. In fact, you have to be a pilot for a certain amount of time, and then you have to assess, you have to get through, then you have to train. There's so many steps that you have to be willing to push yourself to do. So I'm just curious, like, do you feel like you had done these things? Because at this point you're in your mid 20s, maybe even your late 20s, and do you feel like maybe that there was still something more you were looking for? Like you said, that deeper life and that community that goes beyond just, I guess, worldly accomplishments. And I don't want to put any words in your mouth, but I'm just kind of curious myself.
Yeah, no, you hit the nail on the head, Andrew. I think, when I talked about, high school defined by grades and athletics and achievement, and college, get a good GPA, graduate, get a good education. It was very achievement based, like works based. And so I think even seeking to be in the 160th was, I wanted to be with the best, to fly with the best. And then I feel like as I started to unpack my own heart in that area, God really revealed that it's not through my works. And I was trying to fill that void in my heart that was that God-shaped hole with accomplishments and things of the world. And until I think God really started to show me that through the relationships and through getting into the Word, I think that was really where the transformation started to happen. I was definitely, I think it was accomplishment based that brought me into the 160th. And I think God definitely directed that path circumstantially, even though I wasn't submitting to his lordship at the time. But what he did is he planted me in a unit that really needed a believer that was going to be bold to share his faith with those that were there. And so my path to get to the 160th, I think, was selfishly motivated, although God was able in that place to change my heart and change the way I view relationships and the people in my life, to make me a tool for his kingdom. And so I think there was a transformation, and we gloss over it, right? But I was in that frying pan of refinement for a number of years. It began in 2009 as I met Jamie and met the ministry, but to strip off some of the selfishness and some of the um, uh, all of the worldliness and the ways that I define success in my own eyes to look at
Mm.
what God considers, who am I in God's eyes? What is
Yeah.
success in the eyes of Jesus? And so, looking at, some of the scriptures, what does my life look like that ends in Jesus saying, well done, good and faithful servant? And it's
Mm.
not, acing a test or flying for a unit. It's a life of submission and devotion to him and accomplishing his will, proclaim
Mm.
his kingdom to others.
When I think about the life of the Apostle Paul in Galatians chapter 1, he says that God had set him apart from birth and called him from his mother's womb. And yet it wasn't until God was pleased to reveal his son, Jesus, to Paul that Paul's life changed and went on a whole new trajectory. And in fact, Paul went from being someone who was actively fighting against Jesus and his followers and the early church to being someone that we look back now as a pillar, someone that God used in a mighty way. A lot of our New Testament letters, most of our New Testament words are, came through Paul, and he really was used by God in a mighty way to grow the early church and to help it spread across the Roman world at that time. And yet, there was a whole process that happened there. It wasn't until God was pleased to reveal Jesus to Saul, but he had called him from birth. So God had this plan for Paul's life, and he was, I think, actively working in Paul's life in many ways to shape him. A lot of the things that made Paul so effective once he did come to faith and become a follower of Jesus, these were things he learned back when he was a Pharisee and even antagonizing Christians. And I think something I see in your life and that I've seen in my own and in others is that God is teaching us lessons, even in those years where we're blind to him or we're not following him. There are things that we're learning that get redirected once we find the truth and begin to follow Jesus. And I think one of those is just purposeful pursuit, like being all in. It's just that now it's redirected towards the things that really count: the relationship with God, the relationship with his people, and involvement in this greater work that he's doing. So, seeking first the kingdom. If you're someone who's been very aggressive or purposeful about seeking other goals, when God redirects you and you begin seeking first the kingdom, you can bring that same passion and intensity. So, having said that, some of the things that you learned, did you see that in your own life, where some of the ways that you learned to discipline yourself and really pursue high goals, how did you see that carry over into your new life of walking with Christ? And what were some of the new goals that you began to pursue?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think as you were talking, I was thinking about when Paul, or at the time Saul, was blinded during his encounter with Jesus. And when Ananias laid hands on him and healed him, it was like scales that fell from his eyes. And I really do equate my time with the ministry and with Jamie and yourself and others and Mike Chong. And there were a lot of men, Steve McGee and Eric Abshire, Isaac Bones, Luke Calvert. I know you remember the crew. There were a lot of people that I could look to see godly men really pursuing that. And so it really did help me reorient. And I do believe God used some of my characteristics and traits of pursuit of excellence in a way that helped me in my pursuit of him. And he gave me opportunity and positions within the organization to do that as well. And so I do think that our life prior to Christ can be used and reoriented for his purpose. And so a verse that I think really resonated with me, 2 Peter 3:9, where it says, "The Lord is not slow in keeping his promise, as some understand slowness. He is patient with you, not wanting anyone to perish, but everyone to come to repentance." And I think that's really where God wanted me. He wanted me in a place of repentance, and he wanted me to rely on him and not myself. I think I was one of those, proverbial self-made men. It was through my hard work that I've earned these things. And that's how I viewed it, right? And it's a very conceited way of
Hmm.
selfishly viewing my own life. And so God really needed to strip that away from me. And I think he did that through his word. And so some of the goals I set, well, I wanted to read the Bible. I had tried the frontal pursuit and unsuccessfully, right? I may have made it like to Deuteronomy, and I'm like, I don't get it.
Hmm.
So my first Bible in a year reading plan, it took me 22 months. Um, it wasn't quite a year, right? A little bit over,
Right.
but my second time through, it was 9 months. And so again, not that that's a metric of success, but I could see my pursuit and my heart changing and my
Hmm.
relationship with Jesus growing. And so that's where I go back to. It was a process. It did take time. I wasn't overnight professing Christ to my coworkers. It was
Hmm.
a growth over time in influence garnered at work that I could leverage for the kingdom. So
Yeah. Well, we're gonna fast forward it a little bit here because now 2009, you really begin growing in your relationship with Jesus, and like you said, you're in this very unique environment. Again, a very select environment. Not very many people have access to special operations aviation unit, but you're right in there. Now, we're going to talk about the crash and what God taught you both through that experience, but also through the recovery that you've been on over the last several years. But do you know how many deployments you were on prior to the deployment where your helicopter went down?
oh, that's a great
Can
question.
can you keep track?
I think it was my 18th deployment was the one in October of 2017.
Okay, so I just want people to understand that like life is not static as you're growing in your faith and pursuing Jesus. I mean, you are a man on the go, and these deployments, were they all basically deployments where you were in combat, that you had missions that you were flying, um, combat missions?
Yeah, each mission or each deployment was to combat. They were 100% characterized by um, being in the heat of it
Right.
each and every time. So there were no free missions anywhere. It was all in the zone and purposeful missions. We didn't make milk runs. We only took
Hmm.
the elite special forces to the targets that they were pursuing.
Yeah, and I know you may not be able to share. There's certain things you probably can't share, but tell us a little bit more about the unit that you fly for and the type of missions and the type of units that you're working with. Again, not to go into great detail, but just to give some of our listeners who aren't as familiar with the armed forces a sense of the type of combat that you guys would engage in.
Yeah, for sure. So I flew Chinook helicopters at the time, the MH-47 Golf. In the unit, the 160th SOAR, we basically are a unit that stood up back in the 80s out of a failed mission, a rescue attempt in Iran when the hostages were being held. And so out of that operation, basically the U.S. stood up a unit that would be able to perform very unique and specialized missions and have capabilities that may not be present day to day in the conventional forces. And so from that, we've grown over the years, and basically our mission is to support the elite special operation elements of our nation as well as partner nation forces. And so
Mm.
you can think of down where you are, Andrew, in San Diego, you have the SEAL teams,
Right.
and there are other elite organizations, the Rangers and DevGru and others that exist in the world that we will support on missions. And we are the only aviation asset, basically rotary wing wise, that they call on to do that type of support. And so there are a lot more ground forces than there are aviation assets. And so we are in constant demand all over the globe to support our ground forces to get them in and out of the targets.
So typically, you guys are flying elite units such as the SEALs, U.S. Army Rangers, Special Forces. I mean, those are the troops that you're transporting, and of course, they're going in on very high value missions, high levels of difficulty. And so, like you said, this unit, the 160th SOAR, the Night Stalkers, you guys are the aviation special operations unit. You've got that higher level of training so that you can get those troops to those missions. And so, 18 SOAD deployments. And then let's talk a little bit about your deployment there in 2017 and the crash, and just talk us through anything you want to share about that experience, and then also we'll talk about the aftermath of that.
Yeah, so this was I hate to characterize any deployment as routine, but I call this location where we were my timeshare, because I had been there so many times. I might as well have bought property, and I was there visiting. But long and short, this particular mission, we were in support of some partnered nation special forces soldiers. And I was leading a flight of 3 MH-47s. This particular mission, we landed, picked up the ground force, and as we were transitioning into the village, we called them direct action raids. So there was actionable intelligence that prompted a mission into this village, and so we were landing extremely close. We were about 250 meters from the target building, just at the edge of this village as we were infilling. And as we were transitioning in a flight of 3 Chinook helicopters, I was in the lead aircraft. And as I was maneuvering to land on final, we didn't know it at the time, but we were heavily engaged with a PKM. Essentially, that's a Russian machine gun. It shoots linked 7.62 millimeter ammunition. And so it's a small machine gun that they were shooting at our aircraft. And typically we have night vision goggles. We can see the tracer rounds, which every so often there's a round that has basically it will burn, and you can see it visibly as it flies through the air. Well, they had pulled and delinked all of the tracer rounds out of their ammunition. And so we couldn't see any rounds in the air. And this particular armed combatant had pulled this PKM weapon system inside a mud hut, which helped suppress the muzzle flash. So it was very difficult to figure out where we were being shot from. We didn't even realize we were being engaged until the distinct sound of 7.62 piercing through the sheet metal of the aircraft. And so as we essentially are entering the dust cloud, all this is going on. And so my left side of my aircraft, we have some defensive weapon systems on the Chinook, both a 240 as well as a minigun. And both of my left side crew members in the back started to immediately, as they were able to see the muzzle flash and identify positively the point of origin of that combatant, they started to engage as we entered the dust cloud. And so we were still maneuvering the helicopter, slowing down, getting on our final approach into the HLZ as we round out completely. It was one of those zero loom nights where we couldn't see anything, didn't even see the HLZ, which wasn't uncommon at the time. So we transitioned to our basically our instruments, our systems on the aircraft that we can complete the final portion of the approach. And as we were transitioning into the instruments and completing the final portion, there was a little bit of oscillation that had developed from that enemy engagement, but we didn't assess it was anything significant at the time. And basically, as we were landing into the HLZ to download our customers, we call them, it was the Special Forces team in the back of the aircraft, our customers. As we were landing into the HLZ, about 2 feet from our aft gear touching the ground, we did hear and feel what felt like one of our rotor blades contacted some tree branches, some tree limbs. In the HLZ we were landing to, hindsight, we were able to figure this out. We were slightly forward and to the right, and the HLZ was small. And so that put us just on the edge.
Go ahead. The HLZ is, what is that? Hot landing zone? What is the?
No, sorry. Helicopter landing zone is the HLZ. So it's a pre-planned point on the ground that we've already looked at. We've agreed with the ground force. That is the point in which they will start their ground movement to assault the objective area.
So you're landing not only at night, but at a zero illume. Tell us a little bit more about that. Is that like no moon? What makes it zero illume?
Yeah, so the zero loom does come from the lunar cycle, and in this particular evening, the moon didn't rise or set. There, it was not present in the sky, and you couple that basically with the fact that in the U.S. it's hard to imagine what a moonless night looks like because we have so much ground light, so many places. I would equate it to go into an inner room of your house in the middle of the night, shut off all the lights in the house, and close your closet door. That's what zero loom in Afghanistan looks like.
So you're flying this helicopter. You're coming into land. It's pitch black dark. Um, you've got the dust cloud that's coming up that's further obscuring, even if there was light. Um, you're being fired on and being struck, taking hits, and then you feel one of your rotor blades clip some tree limbs as you're coming in. So there's a lot going on here in a very short, compressed amount of time.
Yeah, it was a little bit dynamic, and there was a simultaneous mission that was offset just over a kilometer north of our position with 6 other assets that were flying in. It was a simultaneous infill. Anyway, there was a lot going on. There were loom rockets being fired so that those assets could get into their target and land. So there were a lot of assets overhead. There was a lot going on during this phase of the mission.
Yeah.
And so as we touched down, we downloaded our assault force onto the target, and they began their movement. Um, that's where basically we were going to link back up with our company traffic, the 2 other helicopters that were infilling simultaneous with me as part of my flight. And we were going to then allow the ground force to conduct their actions on while we waited at a different location, refueled, and were postured for any type of contingencies or exfil. But that's not exactly how things went down. So after we struck that tree branch, after we had the engagement, essentially we didn't realize how severe the aircraft was damaged. And I don't know if we'll ever really deduce the actual, this was the golden bullet, so to speak, of specifically what happened. But crash looking backwards, basically they recreated it with our black box, our recorder on the aircraft that they were able to recover after the crash. Essentially, as we took off from infilling the ground force on that helicopter landing zone, we got to just over 100 feet. It was somewhere between 100 and 130 feet. And essentially, our afterrotor system dynamically failed in flight. And the unique aerodynamic tendency with the Chinook, you have 2 counter-rotating rotor systems that intermesh with one another. And so if you have one rotor system come apart, essentially it will eat the other rotor system. And so without those, we can't maintain flight very long. And so essentially what happened, we were along for the ride at that point. We fell from about a little over 100 feet into what ended up being the second story of the bazaar in this village that the ground force was assaulting. And the aircraft basically struck the second story as we were falling from the sky. It inverted upside down, so now the rotors are underneath of us. And the nose was basically perched like nose high up into the second story of the building. And it instantly caught on fire. And so now you have all that's going on in the target, the engagement, the infill of the ground force, and now you have a Chinook that's down on the target itself. So it was a dynamic situation.
Yeah, I mean, I know I've heard this story first person from you, and then I know you also did a podcast that we'll link in the show notes for this one, where you go into more detail on that whole experience. But so how did you get out? How obviously you're here today. So take us from that moment where, okay, the aircraft has come to a stop. How did it come about that you survived that and that you got out of that situation?
Yeah. So one of the casualties of that incident was my co-pilot, Jake Sims. He lost his life on impact when the aircraft went down. And I would say that if you look at other instances of a Chinook going down, like Extortion 1-7 and others throughout different engagements overseas, typically when a Chinook crashes, there's really not much left, and most everyone on board dies. And so it was a miracle that
Mm.
only Jake lost his life that day because we had a crew of 7 on board. And so 6 out of 7 were able to, some were walking and some were not, but make it out of that crash. And that extraction started with our crew members in the back who regained consciousness and were able basically to, through just heroic acts, come back into a burning aircraft to pull their
Mm.
friends out, to pull the crew and the team of that aircraft out. So that was how we engaged. We survived the initial. Was really just our brothers that were on board pulling us out, and then they set up a defensive perimeter, and then later linked up with the ground force, and then we were evacuated via helicopter out of that area to basically higher level care. So medical care was provided on the ground, and then later via follow up at the medical facilities in country.
You talk about the heroics of your crewmates who helped you and some of the others who were on board escape that burning aircraft. And I think I remember before. How long did it take? How long did they have to extract you guys from the aircraft?
Yeah, so as the aircraft inverted and we went down, it basically caught on fire almost immediately, and it was burning. So the engines and the rotors are now upside down. So the engines are on the ground, and it has a bunch of fuel that's now nose high running back towards engines that are burning. And so it basically started from the back of the aircraft, the ramp area, and moved forward to the cockpit. And so basically the entire cabin of our aircraft was fully engulfed in flames in about 30 seconds. So it was the flash to bang on their recovery efforts was quick. And so they all of their night vision goggles were damaged. No one on the crew had a set that made it survive the crash. So they're in zero lume essentially, other than the flames that are essentially giving them some light to pull
Right.
people out. Going back in to pull people out at their own, at the risk of their own life. Because at this point, we had rounds that started to, in the fire, cook off, and they were going off due to the intense heat of the fire and where our weapon systems were placed on the aircraft. So definitely heroics on their part to come back and pull their brothers in arms out and get us clear of that to set up a defensive perimeter. So
now you were one of those who they were able to pull out. What was your condition at this point and going forward?
Yeah, so I was conscious, not coherent. I do have some funny stories of when my buddy came and unhooked me, and I kind of fell like a sack of potatoes from the aircraft, and probably did a little bit of damage to my face. But I think overall, I was in a pretty bad way. I had a traumatic brain injury, so I had a bleed in my prefrontal cortex and occipital lobe of my brain. So in the front and the back, I had an internal bleed. I had my right eye, I think as my goggles crushed down, it basically crushed the whole right side of my body, my face, my ribs. So I had my right eye was popped open. It broke my nose, my upper and lower jaw. It busted out a few teeth in the lower jaw, and then it also dug out a bunch of bone in the lower jaw. I had broken 10 ribs where your femur attaches to your hip. It's called your acetabulum. It's that socket joint. And basically my right hip at the acetabulum was shattered in a bunch of different pieces. I had a midline break in my right femur, and then I had just a bunch of contusions and other injuries, broken fingers, and a laceration in my right tibia, kind of my right shin area, just a huge laceration. So, yeah, I should have died just from the acetabulum and the right femur fracture. Being right there next to arteries and other things, I should have absolutely died. And the way the cockpit ripped away from me, it literally ripped everything back to the point where it came right through. So like the pedal box under my feet, the cyclic between my legs, even my M4 strapped in behind me, which is my weapons, my personal weapon, was all ripped out of the aircraft. So the fact that it ripped literally aircraft out, the only thing that was left in that cockpit area where I was sitting was me upside down in the seat. And so it's a miracle that miracle of God that I survived it. with the injuries that I had, and then I survived the injuries as I was evacuated out of the country. Just to give you an idea of blood loss and I think they gave me, when I went back through my medical records, 12 units of blood prior to evac from theater. And so I'm not a medical technician, but I think your body holds about 11 or 12 units of blood. So they basically gave me a full transfusion in the amount of time as they were patching me up to get me out. So.
Yeah. Well, I know we went through that in detail, and just because I want people to understand just the severity of what you and those others went through, and then the road to recovery. So I know you've shared with me before that you actually don't have memories of the crash itself or the aftermath. In fact, you have sort of a blank space of how many days?
Yeah, so my memory cut off as we were lifting off. So as we came out of that helicopter landing zone and we were taking off, essentially my brain shut off. And I believe that's God's provision and protection. So I don't have to relive some of the trauma that took place immediately after the crash itself, as well as some of what took place on the ground and some of that immediate recovery. But yeah, so I don't have an active memory from that point when I pulled pitch to take off. For about 16 days is when my brain finally rebooted.
Yeah, that's crazy. So you go down on one side of the world, and when you regain consciousness, were you at Walter Reed, or which hospital were you at that point?
Yeah, so I had transitioned from the in-country care, and then I was evac to Landstuhl. From Landstuhl, I was evac back to the U.S., where I landed at Andrews Air Force Base. Then I was transferred over to Walter Reed, which is in Bethesda, Maryland. And I was there for a short period of time. And due to the severity of my injuries, my hip, my acetabulum, and my femur, they basically sent me down to University of Maryland, Baltimore shock trauma. And that's, I think, where you came to see me initially, yourself and Jamie. But I was at that location to get the initial surgery to repair the hip and the femur. And then from there, I went back to Walter Reed. And so it was that full process and transfer had taken place. And I woke up one morning in the ICU at Walter Reed after all that had transpired. And it was almost like my brain had hard reset. It's almost, when your computer starts to malfunction, you reboot it. I feel like that's what happened with my brain. It rebooted in the morning, and that's where I have active memory from. And that's where I ask the questions of, what happened? Where am I? How's the crew? And that's where, I feel like I started to occupy my own mind again. Although I was conscious and coherent and giving, responses that you would expect prior to that, I have no memory or recollection.
Man, we could probably talk for another hour, Brad. But I know one of the things that you and I discussed wanting to talk about in this conversation is just, I guess, the road since then. And in particular, how you've dealt with things like, or have you? Like, I'll say, like, not only are you one of, like, I'm sure you have, but see, like, you're one of the most high achieving guys I know, but you're also one of the most positive people I know. So I'm actually really curious, like, how did you work through frustration, sorrow, disappointment, like questions of God, or even just the pain and the arduous path of recovery? Because you look great, man. Like, you're on the show today, and but 6 years ago you were rough, man. I mean, you had a tough go, and it's just a testament to God's grace, modern medicine, a lot of amazingly talented people who help with the rehab. And then I would just say your and Carrie's own resilience and hard work. But yeah, like, what are some of the things when you think over the last 6 years and, mentally and spiritually that you've wrestled with on this road to recovery? What are some of the things that stand out to you?
Yeah, that's a great question. Like you said, I could probably talk about what God has taught me through this experience for another hour at least. I tried to narrow this focus down a bit, but I probably will still run long. Um, I would say that one of the things that I really saw play out, which is clear from just the crash itself, is that God is still in the miracle business. I think it is a miracle that anyone walked away from that aircraft, to the point where when the ground force eventually made their way to us, they thought they were going to be conducting a full recovery. They didn't think anyone had made it out alive, which is how severe the crash itself was. So the other thing that I learned is God, yes, he does miracles, but I think sometimes and most times he uses the ordinary people to help really encourage and transform people in ways that only God can. And so a verse that really, I think, stood out to me in the recovery process was Galatians 6, 9, and 10. It says, "Do not become weary in doing good, for at the proper time you will reap a harvest if we do not give up. Therefore, as we have opportunity, let us do good to all people, especially to those who belong to the family of believers." And so my wife and I were the benefactors of God's love demonstrated in practicality through people. Immediately after the crash, my wife was descended upon, and I do say that literally by our ministry, by women that she was both pouring into and being encouraged by, and they stayed with her from the moment that she found out until she flew out to meet me in Germany. We were the benefactors of just a myriad of support from our local community. There's a lot of people that say they believe in luck, and I am not one of those. I think that God is in control of all things, and so I'm just going to run down a very brief, just case in point. I couldn't, as a flight lead, as you mentioned, we have very complex missions where we try to synchronize and calculate fuel to the pound and time to the second. And I could not have planned what transpired after this crash. So let me just quickly recap. There was a guy in country that I had been meeting with and trying to help walk with the Lord. His name was Sean Flynn. And I had arranged for him to be on a transport that I was planning to take out the very next day, him as well as a certain amount of people from his unit. And so they had transitioned to our location in theater the night of the crash, because they were going to fly out with us the very next day. And so rather than flying out with us the next day, him as well as one of the guys he was discipling at his outstation in that same theater, they were standing outside the medical facility where I was being operated on, praying. And so I don't think I would have been able to arrange that myself. Two friends who I had met the year prior during a trip to Fort Rucker also was encouraged by and in fellowship in the Lord with. They were they had moved on from there, and they happened to both be in different units. One was a stateside unit that was on a 9-month trip or deployment, and the other was stationed in Germany. But two separate commands, two separate guys were able to, from their commands, to drive down while I was at launch stool and pray over me. There was an Army chaplain that was there at launch stool who is known by the Navs, actually a friend of Mike Chong's, who was the local Levite, the leader of the ministry there at Fort Lewis, who you handed it over to at the time. She was there at launch stool. She knew I was a believer. She was able to pray over me and my wife, who came, and my sister. It was just amazing how God just orchestrated. I was delayed due to my intracranial pressure in my brain from leaving launch stool. And so that delay ended up causing me to leave out without my team left ahead of me, basically the other members of my crew. But so I ended up flying out on a KC-135, which is a big refuel tanker for the Air Force. And I landed at Andrews Air Force Base, as I had mentioned previously. And the first face that my wife saw as the door of the plane opened at Andrews Air Force Base is Myra Liu, who was our former flight surgeon at 4th Battalion and next door neighbor, who she knew very, very well. And so that was the first face who walks on the plane and gives her a big hug. And it just so happened that since he was our next door neighbor, he had moved on to a medical broadening assignment there in the DC area. And one day out of every 6 weeks, he's on Andrews Air Force Base conducting rounds. And that happened to be the day that we landed at Andrews. call it luck. I
So
don't.
this was your neighbor in Washington State who had then gotten transferred to Washington D.C. and just happened to be working that shift.
Yep, he was at that facility on his one day every 6 weeks that he's at that facility. Again, God just arranged some miracles.
Wow.
A former friend, as well as believer in Christ, Damian Calvert, he was actually my former company commander. He had been stationed at the Pentagon the year prior. And so he's a fellow believer in Christ, and him and his wife and their daughter would come visit us at Walter Reed every Sunday just to be with us and encourage us and just continue to. And these are just a few of the myriad of ways that God just used people really to be his arms and feet and really just love us and continue to provide comfort and care in ways that, you know, we needed at the time and we would not have been able on our own to dream up or even, you know, coordinate. So.
Yeah, that's amazing, man. Yeah, I would say like so I haven't ever experienced this from you, but did you ever question God, like why God did you let this happen? How did you deal with, were there times that you despaired? Because, you know, I know it was a very long road to recovery and one that you're actually still on, but you've made such strides since those early months and years. And if so, how did you process that? What keeps someone, what enables someone to have gratitude versus bitterness when they go through a difficulty like that?
Yeah, that's a great question, Andrew. And I definitely struggled early on. As I woke up, I'm a pilot. I can't see out of my right eye. I'm blind now. My body's crushed. I don't know. So without having vision in one eye, I don't even meet Army retention standards. And so my future when I woke up at Walter Reed was very much in limbo of, you know, how am I going to be able to continue? You know, what door is God going to open? What does my future look like? And so I would say that, you know, one of the things God did is he really humbled me. And I would say he tested me. You know, there's some verses in Deuteronomy where God led the people of Israel through the desert for 40 years to test to see what was in their heart. And so I feel like there are situations that come around, even in the lives of believers, that will test our faith and our perseverance in the Lord. And so I do believe my resiliency is tied back to my relationship in Jesus because he is all that matters. And so if I am not rooted in him, I am going to really struggle with woe is me, woe is my current circumstance and situation. And so I really, you know, there are verses I think that I use to provide solace and encouragement to me. And Jesus used them in difficult times in the disciples' life that he was training. So one of which I think John 16:33, he says, I have told you these things so that in me you may have peace. In this world you will have trouble, but take heart, I have overcome the world. And so I think that just really gave me a perspective that it's more than just about my circumstance, my situation. And I need to have peace in Christ and take heart and know that he is in control. And no matter what, as long as I am focused on him, whatever is going to come on this side of heaven is going to come. And I can be assured that he is with me. You know, although he sent a lot of people to be his hands and feet in the life of my wife and I, he was with me every step of the way. And so that, I think for me, really, I had to preach it to myself over and over. But I think that really helped keep me positive and keep me in the right frame of mind to not become negative and really keep me oriented on Jesus. And so it wasn't easy. There were definitely days that were harder than others. One of which one of my good friends flew in from Boston, former platoon leader and now commander, came to visit and we went and dropped him off at the metro. He was going to take the metro to get his flight and fly back. And I was crutching on the way back into our building, and it was snowy and icy. And as I got onto this floor in this building we were living in, one of my crutches flew out from underneath of me. And so I took a tumble. I landed. I tried to shield myself the best I could. I wasn't bearing any weight on my right leg. Everything's broken and damaged. But we ended up in the hospital again, in the ER at this point, for a little over 5 hours. And those days aren't fun when you're having to go
Mm.
get the hip that they just put back together re-x-rayed because you just
Mm.
fell on it. Um, but I think those are the times where you really have to rely and dig deep, and really rely on Jesus to
Mm.
keep your frame of reference oriented on the things that matter. And so I
Yeah.
actually convinced my wife to go eat dinner with me in our room before we went to the ER, that I'd be fine. And so she's a nurse and was not happy about that, but she conceded to at
Oh
least have a
man.
full meal before we sat through the ER for 5 hours to get X-rays. So,
Oh, bro. So, I wanted to ask you this. How this is another big question. So we'll see. It may be something that the answer may come right to mind or not, but you were a certain person, before that mission in, 2017. How has the experience and the suffering and all that you've been through, and, we're just scratching the surface of your story. You and Carrie, your wife, is a cancer survivor, which she was diagnosed with after your crash. So I've watched you guys go through so much over the past 5-6 years. Enough suffering for multiple people over a lifetime. And I know that kind of, one, that's not wasted. God's using that for a purpose. That's what Paul says in Romans, that suffering produces endurance, and endurance does its work in our lives. How have you changed? How have you and Carrie changed? Are you able to begin to see some of the ways that you're a different person today than you were back in 2017?
yeah, that's probably the toughest question you put as we were prepping for this, and I don't know if I have a succinct answer, but
Yeah.
I would say that as far as that goes, I'll try to answer this question the best I can. I am a different person in a lot of ways. Some was just as a direct result of the crash, the TBI that they basically assessed as moderate to severe. And those closest to you, most of my friends probably don't really notice much different about me, but my wife definitely has seen a difference. Um, I'm having to relearn patience. I'm having to relearn communication and things, ways that I connect and relate with my wife, which I'm still, as you mentioned, we are still working on those areas of just continuing to grow together. And I guess it's really finding out what our new normal is, right? So I feel like God, as we look back, I think the two big questions that I think God challenged me with through the past 5 years. The first one was, do you trust me with your life? As the crash happened and he miraculously saved me, I felt like when I was in the hospital room, that was the question. And I really feel like, I answered that question. Yes, God, I trust you with my life. There was not a big wrestle. I was like, yes, I am thankful to God that you always say that you will have faith in those circumstances and situations. But you don't really know until you're thrust into it. And so I thank God that He sustained what faith I thought I had prior to actually getting into that. And I think, not to dovetail into a whole nother subject, but I think our relationship with the Lord prior to this event happening and our intentionality to build that relationship really is what built into the perseverance and the ability to sustain or to sustain underneath of these circumstances, right?
Yeah.
Um, and the second question I feel like God really challenged me with was, do you trust me with your wife's life? And that one, man, that threw me for a loop. And I say that at about the year anniversary of the crash, as I'm working to get back in the cockpit, I became permanently grounded, and I'm trying to go through the medical process to get back into the cockpit and fly. My wife was diagnosed with stage 3 breast cancer, and so that one floored me far worse than the crash did and all the physical. I struggled with the Lord for a few weeks, probably 6 to 7 weeks with that, and that was really that was a wrestle match that was a lot harder. And I think that really stretched me more was, do I trust the Lord with Carrie's life? And so that really, I think, cemented in me just a trust in God's faithfulness, and knowing that He can be trusted with anything and everything. And it's easy, again, it's easy to say, it's a lot harder when it happens to walk. And that's why I wrestled so much with my flesh in that decision of really giving that over to the Lord. And so I feel like that's really grown me. And so although I do have some different things interpersonally with how I relate, how I connect, and how God's continuing to refine certain aspects of the crash, I feel like it's deepened my faith and reliance on the Lord in areas that before may have been superficial, that through the situations that we encountered really became practical. I had to humble myself and give it to the Lord. And so it has grown Carrie and I quite a bit, because we've had to rely really on the grace of the Lord and on His provision in these circumstances and situations. And He's come through each and every time, because He can be trusted. Just because, we've had positive outcomes, it does not mean that equates to the faithfulness of God. I think even if, I never would have flown again, or, whatever that might have looked like, I think God is still faithful and can be trusted. And so it's a choice to continue to seek Him. And I think it's really built into my relationships, my intentionality. And one thing I didn't mention that I probably should is the boldness in pursuing Jesus and the boldness in proclaiming the kingdom. A man's days are numbered, like in John 14. And so I think really I've learned to count my days and really take advantage of things and not let opportunities pass. And so and that was cemented. My co-pilot Jake, as a flight lead, I chose to fly with him because I didn't think he was a believer, and I was able to talk with Jake about his faith prior to that crash. And really, who I thought was an atheist, found out that he, based on what he knew of Christ, was making decisions in his life to live a life of consideration and honor to what he knew of Jesus. And so for me, that gave me a sense of peace when I found out that Jake did not make it home, and that he is walking with the Lord today and he does not have pain. And so I think, taking advantage of those opportunities, because not everybody's deployed in combat. I got it. But you don't know when your coworker or when your loved one is going to, walk out of the house and get hit by a car, or, life happens. Life happens to believers and unbelievers. And so taking advantage and counting our days and just trying to make the most of them. So I would say those are probably the ways that God has challenged me, and we continue, both Carrie and I, to grow and try to be a little bit more intentional and trust and lean into God. So,
yeah, I mean, just some thoughts there that as you were sharing, life that struck me is, just this truth that life is a gift. And every day it's kind of a meme, but it's the hourglass, the sands of the hourglass, like it's a gift, but it's passing, for each of us, we're one day closer to the time when our race on this earth ends. And so just that perspective and enjoying life, but also taking life serious, that God has entrusted us with this gift. And life isn't always easy. In fact, oftentimes it's difficult. And so, just having that perspective that it's a gift from God, but there's also difficulties, and your life and the way you've lived it since I've known you, it does remind me of the verses at the end of Matthew 7, where Jesus talks about those who hear the words of Jesus and act on them will be like a man who built his life on the solid rock. And when those storms of life came, it withstood the difficulties and the turmoil. So, man, I really I appreciate you coming on and sharing with us. I don't know if there's any final thoughts that you want to leave our audience with. I think you covered a lot of great stuff. So,
yeah, I think, man, there's so many things. I skipped over a few. The one that I think in hindsight really stands out the most is, although we didn't realize it at the time, our intentionality in pursuing a relationship with Jesus is really what built our resiliency. As you mentioned in the foundation was built on Christ. And so I think, verses like Paul writing the church of Corinth in 1 Corinthians 9, 26 and 27, it
Mm,
really lends to that. Like, therefore, I do not run like a man running aimlessly. I do
mm,
not fight like a man beating the air. No, I beat my body and make it my slave so that after I have preached to others, I myself will not be disqualified for the prize. And I think that there's an intentionality of living life and pursuing Jesus that is going to build that foundation that we can weather the storm of life. And really, I think I mentioned it early on, but we want to serve and build the kingdom so that when God comes to give account, he will refer to how we're doing
mm.
that and say, "Well done, good and faithful servant." And so um, I'm nothing without him, and just trying to steward the things that he's given me in a way that would bring him honor. And so that's really the pursuit: love God and love people.
That's awesome, man. It was definitely something that stood out to me when you were sharing. I hope folks picked up on it, but yes, the time to prepare for the difficult days is in the good days. And so, a lot of us may have a hard time identifying with your experience and the level of difficulty and suffering that you've been through in recent years. And yet we can follow your example of, seeking the Lord, going deep in the scriptures, going deep in relationships with other believers who are going to encourage us to live for the things that really matter. And if God in his sovereignty does allow us to go through those difficult times, those investments that we've made during the good times, so to speak, it sounds like that's what you're saying, that you believe that really set the foundation and set the stage. And it goes back, I know you said, let's not grow weary in doing good, those verses out of Galatians. But he talks about reaping what you sow, and it's definitely a testimony to walk with God in the good times, and you'll be more drawn to trust him in the difficulties. So, man, thanks for coming on, Brad. Would love to have you on again in the future, and we'll just talk about life and ministry. And I know you're actively making disciples these days, so I really appreciate your example, brother, and I appreciate you being on today.
Likewise, Andrew. Thanks for the time. I really appreciate it.